Dearest listeners, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a woman who has tasted power rarely wishes to return to subjugation, even when that subjugation comes wrapped in the silken bonds of matrimony. Yet today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a duchess who discovered not only strength in solitude, but grace in sharing that strength with another. This is a story of hearts that learned to beat in harmony after years of silence, of two souls who found in each other not completion, but companionship. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The morning sun cast golden benedictions across the magnificent grounds of Winterbourne Abbey as Duchess Isabel Winterbourne stood at the window of her study, her fingers tracing the worn edges of estate ledgers that had become as familiar as old friends. At 32, she possessed a beauty that had been tempered by responsibility and softened by compassion. Each line around her green eyes told a story of late nights tending sick tenants. Each strand of silver in her auburn hair marked a crisis weathered with grace. This particular morning carried a bittersweet weight upon her shoulders. It was the anniversary. 10 years to the day since word had arrived of Edward's death at Ciudad Rodrigo. Her fingers found the mourning locket at her throat, warming the cold metal with her touch. Inside lay not a portrait of her late husband. Their acquaintance had been too brief for such intimacies, but a pressed wild Yorkshire rose, the first bloom she had successfully cultivated in defiance of conventional wisdom. The hardy flower, which gardeners insisted could never be tamed, had bloomed against all probability in her conservatory. It seemed a fitting metaphor for her own unlikely flowering. The transformation from frightened bride to formidable duchess had been a journey marked not by dramatic moments, but by countless small acts of courage. 10 years prior, she had been a bride of barely 22, her heart still full of romantic novels and girlish dreams. The marriage to the Duke of Winterbourne had been arranged with the swift efficiency of great families securing their futures. She had known Edward for precisely 14 days before speaking their vows in the ancient chapel at Winterbourne. She remembered every detail of that day with the clarity that comes from replaying a moment countless times. The weight of her grandmother's pearl necklace against her throat, the scent of orange blossoms in her bouquet, so sweet it made her slightly dizzy, Edward's hands, surprisingly gentle as he lifted her veil, and the unexpected kindness in his eyes as he whispered an apology for the haste of their union. His promise to return and court her properly had seemed romantic then, a love story delayed rather than denied. Their wedding night had been an exercise in gallantry that now, with the wisdom of years, she recognized as not merely remarkable, but nearly unprecedented. Edward had come to her chamber not with the expectations of a bridegroom, but with the courtesy of a friend. He had kissed her hand with infinite tenderness, speaking of the future they would build together when he returned. His consideration for her innocence, his refusal to claim rights before earning affection, at the time, she had thought it romantic, but years later she understood the true magnitude of that gesture. A duke who placed her sensibility above centuries of ducal duty, above the paramount need for an heir, was rarer than diamonds in coal. Such restraint was almost unheard of in their world, where marriages were contracts and wives were expected to submit regardless of sentiment. 3 months after his departure, the messenger had arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday that seemed to weep in anticipation of its news. She could still feel the texture of that moment, the cold marble beneath her feet as she descended the stairs, the way the messenger's wet cloak dripped steadily onto the floor, creating a small pool that reflected the light from the chandelier above. The words themselves had seemed impossible, foreign things that her mind refused to translate into meaning. Edward was dead. His body was lost. She was a widow. But what manner of widow was she? She had grieved, certainly, but it was the grief of possibility rather than presence. She mourned the conversations they would never have, the children who would never be born, the love that would never have chance to bloom. It was a sorrow both profound and strangely abstract, like mourning a character from a book whose story had ended too soon. The ton had descended upon her widowhood like carrion birds, some offering genuine sympathy while others circled with barely concealed anticipation of her failure. The Winterbourne holdings were vast, 3 estates sprawling across Yorkshire, numerous tenant farms that housed over 300 families, investments in shipping ventures that connected British wool to Indian cotton, and a seat in Parliament that influenced the lives of thousands. Her mother had arrived within the week, full of plans and portentous warnings about the impossibility of a woman managing such responsibility. Yet something had awakened in Isabel during those first dark weeks, not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet determination that surprised everyone, including herself. It began with Mrs. Thompson, a tenant's wife who had walked 5 miles through mud and rain to beg for help. Her husband lay dying of lung fever, and without the Duke's intervention, they would lose their farm. Isabel had looked into the woman's eyes, red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear, and seen not a supplicant, but a mirror of her own vulnerability. The decision to help had been instinctive, but the execution required learning skills no lady's education had provided. Mr. Pemberton, the estate steward, had become her unlikely tutor. A man of 60 years who had served 3 dukes, he had initially viewed her interest with the patronizing patience one might show a child playing at adult occupations. But Isabel's quick mind and genuine dedication had soon won him over. She learned to read account ledgers with the same attention she had once devoted to watercolors, finding in the columns of numbers a kind of poetry, the rhythm of seasons, the harmony of balanced accounts, the crescendo of a particularly good harvest. Under her gentle but unwavering guidance, the estates had not merely survived, but flourished with new life. She had corresponded with agricultural innovators across England and Scotland, her desk becoming a treasure trove of letters discussing soil improvement and crop rotation. The 4-field system she implemented had increased yields by 30%, but more importantly, it had given the tenants hope. The school she established for their children, taught by a progressive governess from Edinburgh named Miss Bennet, had become a beacon of possibility in the Yorkshire countryside. The transformation of the winter-born London residents reflected her own evolution. What had once been a masculine domain of dark wood and hunting trophies became a salon where ideas bloomed like flowers in spring. Her Thursday afternoon gatherings attracted poets who read verses that made dowagers weep, politicians who debated reform with passion that shook the chandeliers, and scientists who explained their discoveries with an enthusiasm that was contagious. Through it all, she maintained perfect propriety, her Aunt Lady Constance serving as both chaperone and co-conspirator in this gentle revolution. Lady Constance Fairweather had become far more than a societal requirement. She had become the mother of Isabel's heart, offering wisdom earned through 70 years of observing human nature. A woman who had chosen spinsterhood over a loveless marriage, she understood the delicate dance Isabel performed daily, balancing authority with femininity, strength with grace. The marriage proposals had come like autumn leaves, 17 in total over the years, each refused with a kindness that left the suitors more charmed than offended. Lord Pembroke alone had persisted beyond propriety, arriving each season with increasingly elaborate gifts that Isabel returned with notes of such gracious refusal that he treasured them despite their rejection. She had earned the sobriquet Ice Duchess from those who mistook dignity for coldness, yet those who truly knew her understood the warmth that flowed beneath the surface. There was young Mary, the scullery maid, whose gift for mathematics Isabel had recognized and carefully nurtured. Rather than attempting the impossible, elevating a servant girl to a station that society would never accept, Isabel had done something cleverer and kinder. She had promoted Mary to assistant to the estate's bookkeeper, training her in accounting and estate management. The position offered respectability, good wages, and the use of her mathematical gifts without creating a scandal that would have destroyed the girl's reputation. The Ton had whispered even at this modest elevation, but Isabel had weathered their disapproval with her usual grace. Her daily routine had become a source of deep contentment. Dawn rides across the moors, when the world was painted in shades of pearl and gold, provided moments of communion with something greater than herself. The wind that tangled her hair carried whispers of all the women who had never had such freedom, and she rode for them as much as herself. Hours devoted to correspondence and estate business became acts of creation, each decision rippling outward to touch hundreds of lives. The letter arrived on an unseasonably warm September afternoon, when Yorkshire had donned its finest autumn attire of gold and crimson. Isabel was in her beloved conservatory, a glass cathedral she had built to shelter impossible dreams. The roses she tended there were more than mere flowers. They were living proof that beauty could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that gentleness and strength could coexist in perfect harmony. She was examining a particularly promising hybrid, one that married the wild rose's resilience with the tea rose's elegance, when Stevens approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. The butler, who had served the family for 20 years and had learned to navigate the delicate balance of serving a duchess rather than a duke, carried himself with the careful bearing of one delivering news that would shatter worlds. The War Office's letter bore the weight of resurrection. As Isabel's trembling fingers broke the seal, she felt the earth shift beneath her feet, as if the very foundations of Winterbourne Abbey were rearranging themselves to accommodate this impossible truth. The words swam before her eyes like fish in disturbed water, requiring multiple readings before their meaning penetrated the fortress of her disbelief. Edward lived, not buried in Spanish soil, not lost to the violence of war, but alive, held captive for 10 years in a French prison, his memory stolen by a head wound, his identity lost in the chaos of battle, until a British physician, visiting to arrange prisoner exchanges, had recognized the lost duke in a man who had forgotten his own name. The conservatory's humid air became thick as honey, too sweet to breathe. The letter slipped from nerveless fingers, floating like a dying bird to rest among the scattered rose petals on her workbench. Isabel sank onto the wrought iron bench she had placed there for moments of quiet contemplation, though she had never imagined contemplating something of this magnitude. Her first coherent thought was touchingly mundane. The rose graft she had been working on would fail if not completed immediately. This simple concern anchored her as the world transformed around her. With fingers that moved by memory rather than conscious thought, she completed the delicate work, binding 2 different roses into what might, with luck and care, become something new and beautiful. The metaphor was not lost on her, even in her shock. Lady Constance found her there an hour later, still holding the letter as if it were made of spider silk that might dissolve at rough handling. Her aunt, whose wisdom had been forged in the fires of her own unconventional choices, needed only one glance to understand that their carefully constructed world was about to change irrevocably. The older woman's response was characteristic, practical, wrapped in compassion. She gathered Isabel into an embrace that smelled of lavender and safety, holding her as sobs finally came. Not tears of joy or sorrow, but something more complex, an emotion for which language had no adequate name. It was the cry of a woman mourning the loss of a life she had built, while simultaneously acknowledging the possibility of something she had never dared imagine. That evening, Isabel assembled the household in the great hall where portraits of 17 generations of Winterbournes gazed down with painted eyes. The servants gathered with faces full of curiosity and concern. From Mrs. Hammond, who had served since Edward was a boy and remembered him with the fierce love of a woman who had no children of her own, to young Tom the boot boy, hired just last month, who had never known a world where the Duke of Winterbourne existed. Isabel announced the news with a composure that was its own form of courage, watching as waves of emotion crashed through the assembled staff. Mrs. Hammond wept openly, her weathered hands clasped as if in prayer. Stevens stood straighter, his mind already calculating the 1,000 adjustments required to restore the household to its traditional order. The younger servants, those who had known only Isabel's gentle authority, exchanged glances of uncertainty tinged with loyalty to the mistress who had earned their devotion through a decade of considerate leadership. The preparations that followed took on an almost dreamlike quality. The Duke's chambers, sealed since that terrible day 10 years ago, were opened like a tomb being restored to life. Sunlight, stranger to these rooms for so long, crept tentatively across surfaces thick with dust and memory. His belongings emerged from their slumber, books with pages marked at passages he would never read, correspondence half finished, a riding crop hung precisely where he had left it that final morning. As she supervised the restoration, Isabel found herself touching these objects with a tenderness that surprised her. They were artifacts of a man she had barely known, yet they spoke of hopes and plans, of a future he had imagined that bore no resemblance to the decade that had actually unfolded. A journal entry, dated the day before his departure, mentioned looking forward to truly knowing his bride. The poignancy of it made her heart ache with unexpected grief for the couple they might have been. The study presented the most painful challenge. This room, which had become her sanctuary and command center, held 10 years of her transformation. Agricultural treatises annotated in her careful hand lined the shelves. Maps marked with her crop rotation plans covered one wall. Correspondence from fellow innovators across England filled carefully organized files. To vacate this space felt like evacuating part of her soul, yet there was no question. It was the Duke's study, had always been the Duke's study, despite her decade of occupation. The October morning of Edward's return dawned with Yorkshire wearing a veil of mist, as if nature itself sought to soften the harsh edges of this impossible reunion. Isabel had risen before dawn, unable to find rest in sleep that brought only dreams of strangers wearing familiar faces. She chose her clothing with the careful strategy of a general preparing for battle. Not the battle of conquest, but of negotiation, seeking terms that would honor both past and present. The emerald velvet gown she selected was neither the black of mourning she had long abandoned, nor the soft pastels of a hopeful bride, but something altogether different. The deep, rich color of growth and life, of things that endure through seasons of change. Her mother's emeralds at her throat caught the light like captured tears, beautiful in their complexity. She positioned herself in the entrance hall with the household staff arranged in perfect formation, though she could feel their nervous energy humming like a plucked string. Mrs. Hammond clutched a handkerchief embroidered with the Winterbourne crest, dabbing at eyes that had not stopped leaking since dawn. Stephen stood at attention with military precision, though Isabel noticed his hands trembling slightly, the only sign of emotion she had ever seen from the imperturbable butler. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel at precisely noon sent a flutter through her chest, not the romantic anticipation of a wife greeting her husband, but something more complex. Through the tall windows that had watched over centuries of arrivals and departures, she glimpsed the ducal carriage she had not used in 10 years, preferring her smaller, more practical vehicle that better suited a woman traveling alone. The man who emerged moved with the careful deliberation of someone relearning the geography of his own body. Edward stood for a long moment, gazing up at Winterbourne Abbey, as if seeing a vision from a dream he had dreamed so often he could no longer distinguish memory from imagination. When he finally turned toward the entrance, Isabel saw what 10 years of captivity had written upon him. He was simultaneously the man she remembered and a complete stranger. The broad shoulders remained, though they seemed to carry invisible weight. His dark hair, which she recalled as precisely styled in the fashion of young gentlemen, had grown longer and was painted with premature silver at the temples, badges of survival rather than age. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was not disfiguring but transforming, marking him as a man who had walked through fire and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least unbroken. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, those same brown eyes with golden flecks that had looked at her with such kindness on their wedding day. Now they held depths she could not fathom, shadows of experiences that had carved canyons in his soul. Yet beneath the pain and uncertainty, she glimpsed something unexpected, a gentleness that had somehow survived whatever horrors he had endured. He entered his ancestral home with the wondering air of a pilgrim reaching a shrine he had thought never to see. The familiar scent of beeswax and old wood enveloped him, but now it was layered with something new, the fresh, sweet fragrance of roses that had never graced these halls during his father's time. It was as if the house itself had been transformed, the stern, masculine domain of his memory softened by a decade of feminine care. His gaze traveled slowly across the entrance hall, noting changes with an attention that spoke of years spent memorizing every detail from memory alone. The new wallpaper in soft gold rather than the dark green of his youth, the rearranged portraits that now included her family alongside his ancestors, the Chinese vases filled with roses from her conservatory. Each alteration registered in his eyes, though whether with approval or dismay, she could not tell. When their eyes finally met across the length of the hall, the impact resonated through her entire being. For a suspended moment, time seemed to hold its breath. They were two souls taking measure of each other across an impossible divide. 10 years, different worlds of experience, transformations that had remade them both into people their younger selves would not recognize. Edward moved forward with measured steps, stopping at a distance that was neither intimate nor formal, but something uncertainly between. Stevens stepped forward to make the formal announcement, but Edward raised a hand with gentle authority. His voice, when he spoke, carried the roughness of disuse overlaid with emotion, carefully controlled. The words were simple, acknowledging her position, their connection, the strangeness of this moment, but delivered with a courtesy that touched her heart. She responded with equal formality, though she heard the tremor in her own voice. They were performing a careful dance of politeness. Two strangers united by law and separated by everything else, aware of their audience of servants who watched with barely concealed fascination. When Edward was shown to his chambers, Isabel followed at a discreet distance, watching from the doorway as he encountered the preserved remnants of his former life. His fingers traced objects with the reverence of a blind man reading Braille. The silver brush that had belonged to his father, a miniature of his parents painted in happier times, books he had left half-read a decade ago. She noticed how his scarred hands lingered on each item, as if trying to bridge the gap between the man who had owned them and the man he had become. When he discovered his journal, left open on the desk where he had written his final entry before departing for war, his composure finally cracked. His shoulders shook silently as he read his own words from another lifetime, plans and hopes that must have seemed like fiction now. Isabel withdrew, granting him privacy for his grief, understanding that he was mourning not just lost years, but the loss of the man he had been. At dinner, they sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, 20 feet of polished wood between them, like an ocean of propriety. Mrs. Hammond had prepared what she remembered as his favorite dishes: roasted pheasant with wine sauce, potatoes and cream, trifle for dessert. But Edward ate sparingly, as if his stomach had forgotten how to accept such richness. Isabel noticed how he held his silverware, carefully, deliberately, as if relearning civilization itself. Conversation was stilted, confined to the safest shores of mundane topics. Yet when Isabel mentioned the new drainage system that had reclaimed 30 acres of marshland, Edward's eyes lit with genuine interest. He asked intelligent questions that showed he understood not just the technical aspects, but the human impact. How many more families could be supported? How the improved land had strengthened the entire community. November arrived dressed in white, early snow transforming the harsh Yorkshire landscape into something from a fairy tale. The enforced proximity of winter began to work its gentle magic, melting the careful boundaries between the Duke and Duchess like spring thaw. They could not avoid each other entirely, and in those unavoidable encounters, something tender began to take root. The first real breakthrough came on a bitter Tuesday evening when the wind howled like a living thing around the Abbey's ancient stones. Isabel was in the library, her sanctuary of books and warmth, when she heard music drifting from the drawing room, hesitant notes that gradually gained confidence, forming a melody of such haunting beauty that she found herself drawn toward it without conscious decision. She discovered Edward at the pianoforte, his scarred fingers moving across the keys with surprising grace. The melody he played spoke of longing and loss, of hope that persisted despite all reason, of beauty found in the most unexpected places. When he noticed her presence, color rose in his cheeks, and he made to stop, but she gestured for him to continue. As the last notes faded into the crackling of the fire, Isabel found tears on her cheeks, not tears of sorrow, but of recognition. This music was the language of his soul, expressing what words could not capture. When she asked how he had learned to play, his answer revealed another facet of his captivity. A French commandant's wife, lonely and far from home, who had taught him music in exchange for conversation, both of them pretending not to know the truth of his identity, creating a small space of civilization in the midst of barbarism. That evening marked a transformation in their relationship. The music had created a bridge between their separate worlds, and tentatively, carefully, they began to cross it. Edward started accompanying Isabel on her morning rides, initially claiming a need to reacquaint himself with the estate. The first few rides passed in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, like old friends who need not fill every moment with words. On one particularly glorious morning, with new snow sparkling like scattered diamonds beneath a winter sun, their horses broke into a spontaneous gallop across the open moorland. The wind sang in their ears, the cold air burned their lungs, and for a few precious moments, they were not Duke and Duchess, not strangers bound by law, but simply two souls reveling in the joy of being alive. Isabel's laughter rang out across the moors, genuine, unrestrained laughter that seemed to surprise them both. When she glanced at Edward, he was smiling, a real smile that transformed his scarred face into something beautiful. In that moment, she saw not the broken duke or the lost soldier, but the man he was becoming, shaped by hardship, but not defeated by it. Their shared experiences began to reveal unexpected parallels. When they encountered a tenant's cart mired in mud, Edward immediately dismounted to help, putting his shoulder to the wheel without thought for his fine clothes. Watching him labor alongside the farmer, Isabel saw a man who had learned that true nobility had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with service. When she too dismounted to help, ignoring the mud that splattered her riding habit, the look of surprised appreciation in Edward's eyes warmed her more than any fire. In the conservatory, which had become their evening refuge, they discovered a shared passion for making things grow. Edward revealed that tending roses in the French commandant's garden had saved not just his sanity, but his soul. When everything else was brutal and ugly, the simple act of nurturing beauty had reminded him that gentleness could survive even in the harshest conditions. Isabel taught him her hybridization techniques, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked with the delicate plants. Each touch sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the conservatory's humid heat. She began to see how his experiences, terrible as they were, had given him a depth of understanding that matched her own hard-won wisdom. One evening, as they grafted a particularly challenging hybrid, Edward spoke of the men he had known in captivity, not just English soldiers, but French prisoners, Spanish rebels, men from across Europe caught in the machinery of war. He had learned their languages, their stories, their dreams. He had held them as they died, shared his meager rations, kept their memories alive in his heart. Isabel found herself sharing her own battles, not against foreign enemies, but against prejudice and ignorance. She told him about the typhoid outbreak, how the old doctor had dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria while children died. She spoke of the night she had held the Thompsons' youngest child as fever took him, the helplessness that had driven her to implement better practices of cleanliness and waste disposal, to insist on separating water sources from contamination despite fierce opposition from those who called her methods foreign nonsense. They were, they discovered, warriors of different kinds who had fought different battles but understood the cost of victory, the weight of responsibility, the loneliness of command. In each other, they found not just understanding, but recognition. Two souls who had been transformed by circumstance into something stronger than they had ever imagined possible. The letter that shattered their growing harmony arrived in early December, carried by a messenger whose reluctant demeanor suggested awareness of the explosive nature of his delivery. The morning had begun with such promise. Fresh snow had transformed the estate into a crystalline wonderland, and Isabel had found Edward in the breakfast room actually laughing at a letter from one of the tenant children, thanking him for teaching her to skate on the frozen pond. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and the sound was like music. Lord Blackstone's missive arrived like a serpent in their slowly blooming Eden. Written on paper so fine it seemed to mock the ugliness of its contents, it was addressed to Edward with a copy deliberately sent to Isabel, a calculated breach of all propriety designed to wound as deeply as possible. With the cold precision of an anatomist dissecting a corpse, Blackstone laid bare the most intimate aspects of their marriage. Yet beneath the cruel words, one could detect the bitter conviction of a man who truly believed himself the guardian of natural order, convinced that neither an independent duchess nor a broken duke were fit to rule. He cited canon law and legal precedent, noting that unconsummated marriages could be annulled, particularly when one party had been absent and presumed dead for a decade. But it was his personal observations that cut deepest. His suggestions that Edward was too damaged by his ordeal to be a proper husband, that Isabel had proven herself too independent to submit to masculine authority, that both would be happier freed from the bonds of their impossible union. In Blackstone's twisted logic, he was not destroying but restoring, not cruel but correct. The cruelty was multi-layered and masterful. By making their private circumstances a matter of semi-public speculation, Blackstone had not merely insulted them, but exposed them to the gossip mills of society. Worse, his argument held uncomfortable legal merit, and they both knew it. Edward's reaction was volcanic. Isabel, entering the library for their customary evening reading, found a man she had not seen before. Not the broken duke, or the gentle soul who played piano, but the warrior who had survived 10 years of hell. He paced the room like a caged wolf, his movements sharp and dangerous, every muscle taut with rage. The letter was crumpled in his fist, and she could see his knuckles white with the force of his grip. The very air seemed to vibrate with his fury. Books trembled on their shelves as he passed. For the first time since his return, Isabel felt a flicker of fear, not of him, never of him, but of the pain that could transform gentleness into rage, of the way cruelty could wound even the strongest souls. When he finally noticed her presence, his expression shifted through a symphony of emotions, anger melting into embarrassment, embarrassment into vulnerability, vulnerability into something that might have been desperate hope. Without a word, he handed her the letter, watching her face as she read Blackstone's poisonous words. What followed was their first genuine confrontation. Edward's rage was not just about the insult to their marriage, but about the threat to something precious that had been growing between them. He spoke of honor and duty, of the sanctity of marriage vows. But beneath the conventional words, Isabel heard something else, genuine fear of losing her, not as a possession, but as the unexpected grace that had entered his life. Isabel's own temper, so long controlled, finally erupted. But her anger was not directed at Edward. It was for him, for them, for the cruel world that sought to reduce their complex reality to simple categories. She raged against men like Blackstone, who saw her independence as something to be conquered rather than celebrated, who viewed Edward's gentleness as weakness rather than strength. Yet even in her anger, she was painfully aware that Blackstone's words contained truth. Their marriage was indeed unconsummated. She had indeed managed alone for a decade. The question that hung between them, unspoken but deafening, was whether these facts mattered more than the tender connection they had begun to build. Before either could voice the questions burning in their hearts, Stevens interrupted with news of crisis. Fire at the Harrison farm, the winter feed stores threatened, livestock in danger. The urgency in his voice was underscored by the distant sound of the alarm bell tolling across the frozen fields. Without hesitation, both Duke and Duchess pushed aside their personal turmoil to address the emergency. They rode through the snowy night together, their earlier conflict temporarily forgotten in the face of their tenants' need. As they approached the farm, the night air filled with terrifying sounds, the sharp crack and roar of timber consumed by flames, the desperate lowing of frightened cattle, the shouts of men passing water buckets in frantic rhythm. The acrid smoke stung their eyes and throats as they dismounted, immediately taking charge of the chaos. Working side by side through the night, they discovered a harmony that transcended their awkward attempts at marriage. Edward's military experience organized the firefighting efforts with remarkable efficiency. Isabel's intimate knowledge of each family's resources coordinated the support network that would see the Harrisons through this crisis. Together, they saved not just property, but a family's future. Returning to the Abbey as dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, exhausted and covered in soot, they shared a moment of perfect understanding. In crisis, they had functioned as true partners, each contributing unique strengths, creating something greater than the sum of their parts. Lady Constance chose this moment for strategic intervention. Over breakfast, as they sat exhausted but strangely exhilarated from the night's work, she announced her intention to visit her sister in Bath for Christmas. The meaningful look she gave them both made her intentions clear. They needed time alone, without the buffer of her presence, to determine what they truly wanted from each other and their marriage. That evening, Isabel found a letter slipped under her door in Edward's careful hand. Her heart raced as she opened it, but what she found was neither declaration nor proposition, but something far more unexpected, a thoughtful proposal for partnership in managing their estates. He suggested they work together to create a new approach to estate governance, combining his military logistics experience with her agricultural innovations. But between the formal lines, she read something deeper, an offer of partnership that went beyond estate matters, a promise to honor who she had become rather than trying to reshape her into a conventional wife. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in a blizzard that transformed Winterbourne Abbey into an island universe, cut off from the outside world and its judgments. The isolation felt like a gift from Providence, creating a sacred space where two souls could finally speak truths too tender for the harsh light of society. They dined together in the small parlor rather than the vast formal dining room, the intimate setting glowing with candlelight that softened edges and invited confidences. The meal was simple. Mrs. Hammond had prepared comfort rather than elegance, but it tasted of home and hope. After dinner, Edward produced a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. Inside, Isabel discovered a leather journal filled with his careful handwriting, pages upon pages of observations he had quietly compiled over the past months. But this was no mere record of events. It was a testament to her decade of leadership, a detailed account of every innovation, every kindness, every moment of courage he had witnessed or learned about. He had interviewed tenants, recording their stories of how she had saved their farms, educated their children, nursed them through illness. He had documented her agricultural improvements with the precision of a historian, her financial management with the respect of a fellow strategist. But more than that, he had captured the soul of her work, the compassion that motivated every decision, the strength that never crushed the vulnerable, the wisdom that had grown from responsibility. Isabel's vision blurred with tears as she read his words. This was not just validation, but recognition of the deepest kind. He had seen her, truly seen her, not as an aberration to be corrected, but as something magnificent to be celebrated. When she could finally speak, her voice trembled with emotion as she asked why he had done this extraordinary thing. His answer was simple yet profound. Whatever happened between them, history should remember the Duchess of Winterbourne not as a placeholder, but as a transformer, not as a woman who had exceeded expectations, but as a leader who had redefined them. The journal was his gift to posterity, ensuring her achievements would not be erased or diminished by time or convention. The gesture broke something open in Isabel, not something that was whole, but something that had been frozen. The tears that came were like spring rain, washing away years of solitary strength to reveal the tender shoots of trust beneath. When Edward moved to comfort her, she did not pull away but let herself be held, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart that had somehow kept rhythm through years of captivity. In the safety of his arms, she found herself speaking truths she had barely admitted to herself. She had not missed him specifically. How could she miss someone she had barely known? But she had missed the possibility of him, the promise of partnership, the dream of someone who might see her strength as something to celebrate rather than suppress. These past months had shown her glimpses of what that might look like, and it was more beautiful than anything she had imagined. Edward then told her the complete truth of his captivity, not just the facts, but the feelings. The head injury had stolen his memories for nearly 2 years, leaving him a ghost without a past. When his memories returned, they were like daggers, each one reminding him of what he had lost. The commandant, discovering his identity, had faced a terrible choice. The man was a fervent Bonapartist, whose own brother had died at the hands of British cavalry. To release a duke would be his duty. To keep one was his revenge. But more practically, Edward had become essential to maintaining the commandant's wife's beloved gardens, the only thing that brought her joy in their remote posting. The commandant had hidden Edward's identity not just from cruelty, but from a twisted combination of vengeance and domestic necessity, reporting him dead while keeping him as their invaluable gardener. But it was not the physical hardship that had nearly broken him. It was the knowledge that everyone he loved believed him dead. He had sustained himself with elaborate fantasies of home, constructing entire conversations with the wife he barely knew, imagining the life they would build together. In his dreams, she had been many things, sometimes shy and sweet, sometimes bold and passionate, but never had he imagined she would be this magnificent reality that exceeded every dream. As midnight approached, bringing Christmas Day on wings of continued snowfall, they found themselves sitting close together before the fire, the space between them charged with possibility. Edward made his proposition, not a demand or expectation, but an offer born of respect and growing love. They would build something new together, a marriage that honored both who they had been and who they had become. He would publicly support her continued management of the estates she knew so well. She would help him find his place in a world that had moved on without him. Together, they would face society's judgment and create their own definition of what marriage could be. But first, and here his voice grew tender, she must have the choice that had been denied her 10 years ago. If she wished for annulment, he would support it, would ensure she retained control of the improvements she had made, would secure her financial independence. The choice must be entirely hers, freely made, unclouded by duty or obligation. Isabel rose and moved to the window, watching snow erase the familiar landscape into something new and unmarked. The blizzard had transformed the world into a blank page, waiting to be written upon. Behind her, she felt Edward's presence, patient and warm, giving her space to think but remaining close enough that she knew she was not alone. The choice he offered was real. She knew him well enough now to trust his word completely. She could have her freedom, could maintain the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. Lord Blackstone's letter had made the legal path clear. Society might gossip, but she had weathered worse storms. Yet as she stood there, she realized that freedom was not the same as isolation, that strength did not require solitude, that independence and partnership were not opposites, but could, in the right circumstances, enhance each other. What Edward offered was not subjugation, but collaboration, not the erasure of her achievements, but their multiplication through shared effort. When she turned back to him, her decision was clear in her eyes before she spoke it. But Isabel, the woman she had become through 10 years of solitary leadership, would not simply accept. She would negotiate. Her proposition was bold and unconventional. They would court each other properly, as the people they were now, rather than the strangers they had been. They would take the winter and spring to truly know each other, and if, when summer came, they both wished it, they would renew their vows, not as duty, but as choice, not as arrangement, but as love. Edward's joy was incandescent, though he tried to contain it, but she saw it in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his scarred face softened, the way his hand reached for hers with infinite tenderness. When their fingers intertwined, it felt like coming home to a place she had never been, but always belonged. The winter months that followed were a revelation written in snow and firelight, in shared laughter and comfortable silences. Released from the awkwardness of undefined relationship, Edward and Isabel discovered they were not just compatible but complementary, two halves of a conversation that had been waiting 10 years to begin. Their courtship was unlike anything the Ton would have recognized, yet it was perfect for who they were. Morning rides became adventures of discovery, not just of the estate they both loved, but of each other. Edward showed her how to read the land with a soldier's eye, seeing defensive positions and supply lines. Isabel taught him to see with a nurturer's vision, recognizing which fields were tired and needed rest, which families were struggling and needed support. In the conservatory, their sanctuary of warmth and growth, they worked side by side on increasingly ambitious hybrid roses. The moment of revelation came when Isabel showed him the source of her first successful cultivation, the wild Yorkshire rose that experts claimed could never be domesticated. Edward's hands trembled as he recognized it. It was the same variety he had tended in France, the English savage the commandant's wife had loved. A British prisoner before him had planted it from seeds carried in his pocket, a piece of home that had somehow survived and flourished in foreign soil. Their creation of the hybrid became more than a horticultural experiment. It was a joining of their parallel journeys. taking cuttings from Isabel's domesticated wild rose and grafting them with Edward's memories of the French garden techniques. They created something unprecedented. When their first successful hybrid bloomed, a rose of impossible beauty that combined Yorkshire hardiness with delicate grace, they named it Redemption. It was not just a flower, but a living testament that the same wild rose that had sustained them separately through their trials could, with patience and love, bloom into something even more beautiful together. Edward's musical talents became part of their evening ritual. He would play while Isabel read, the music weaving around her consciousness like a gentle embrace. Sometimes she would set down her book and simply listen, watching the way his face transformed when lost in melody, seeing the soul that had survived captivity through beauty. They began teaching each other their hard-won skills. Edward instructed Isabel in military strategy using the chess set in the library, delighting in her quick mind and unconventional approaches. She often defeated him by refusing to play by traditional rules, creating strategies that would have horrified military academicians but achieved remarkable victories. In return, Isabel shared her decade of accumulated wisdom about estate management, but more than that, she shared her philosophy of leadership through compassion. She showed him how strength could be gentle, how authority could uplift rather than oppress, how true power came from empowering others. The Tun watched their unconventional courtship with fascination and no small amount of scandal. A duke actively courting his own duchess was unprecedented, particularly when that duchess maintained her authority over estate matters. At social gatherings they were forced to attend, they presented a united front that confused and intrigued in equal measure. When Lord Blackstone, still pursuing his cruel campaign, suggested publicly that Edward's mind had been affected by his captivity, Isabel's response was magnificent. With perfect calm and a smile that could have frozen hell, she detailed Lord Blackstone's own financial disasters, which Edward's affected mind had analyzed and could solve if Blackstone wished to submit his accounts for review. The offer was declined, and Blackstone retreated to his Irish estates in defeat. By spring, their courtship had evolved into something deeper than either had anticipated. The careful touches that had begun as courtesy, a hand offered to help her mount her horse, fingers brushing as they passed books, had become a language of their own. Each touch carried promise, each glance held volumes of growing affection. The turning point came during the spring festival at the village. They had worked together to organize the celebration, and the joy on their tenants' faces was testament to their partnership. Watching Edward swing laughing children in circles while Isabel distributed prizes with genuine delight, something crystallized between them. Their eyes met across the village green, and in that shared glance was recognition, acceptance, and unmistakable love. That evening, in the rose garden where their hybrid redemption bloomed in impossible beauty, Edward kissed her for the first time. It was not the passionate claiming of romantic novels, but something infinitely more precious, a gentle exploration between two souls who had learned to value each other's strength, respect each other's scars, and cherish each other's growth. When summer arrived, bringing with it the fulfillment of their agreement, there was no question of their decision. Their renewed vows were spoken in the chapel at Winterbourne, with only Lady Constance, the household staff, and a few trusted tenants as witnesses. Isabel wore not virginal white, but deep burgundy, the color of fine wine aged to perfection. Edward's vows broke from tradition, promising not to protect and provide, but to support and celebrate, to honor not just his wife, but his partner, his equal, his love. Their wedding night was spent together at last, and if the details remain private, the joy was visible to all. The household noticed a new ease between them, touches that lingered with promise, shared glances that spoke of nights and mornings of discovered intimacy. They maintained separate studies but shared a bedchamber, finding in physical union another form of the partnership they had built in every other aspect of their lives. When the announcement came the following spring that the Duchess was with child, the Tun buzzed with the kind of gossip that feeds on happiness it doesn't understand. But for the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne, society's opinion had long ceased to matter. They had created their own world, their own definition of marriage, their own understanding of love. Their son was born on a spring morning when the roses were in first bloom, a healthy child who possessed his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. But more than physical features, he would inherit something far more valuable, the example of parents who had chosen each other not from duty but from recognition, who had built love not on passion alone but on respect, understanding, and the kind of trust that can only be earned through trial. Years later, when their children asked about their unusual story, Isabel would say that sometimes the best marriages were those that began at the end, with two fully formed people choosing to build something together. Edward would add that the strongest partnerships were forged not in ease, but in challenge, not in youth's untested promises, but in maturity's proven commitment. The roses they bred together still bloom at Winterbourne Abbey, varieties that shouldn't exist according to conventional breeding wisdom, but thrive nonetheless. They stand as living testament to the power of patient nurturing, of combining different strengths, of creating beauty from what others might see as impossible circumstances. Their love story became legend in Yorkshire, though the Tun never quite knew what to make of it. Some called it a romance more beautiful than any novel. Others insisted it was merely a practical arrangement that happened to include affection. The truth, as Lady Ravenswood knows, was both simpler and more complex. It was two remarkable people recognizing that they were better together than apart, that love could grow from respect, that partnership could be its own form of passion. The Duchess never surrendered her authority over the estates she had managed so well. The Duke never asked her to. They ruled together, their marriage a testament to the revolutionary idea that power shared was not power diminished, but power multiplied. In their own quiet way, they changed what aristocratic marriage could be, one tender choice at a time. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, growing not like a wildfire that consumes, but like a garden that nourishes, not through conquest, but through cultivation. The Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne discovered that the greatest romance was not in surrendering to another, but in choosing to stand beside them, equal in dignity, respect, and ultimately in love. Their story reminds us that sometimes the longest journey is not across battlefields or years of separation, but the distance between two hearts learning to beat as one while remaining gloriously, independently themselves. In an age when women were expected to be decorative additions to their husbands' lives, Isabel Winterbourne proved that a woman could be both powerful and beloved, both independent and partnered. In an era when men were supposed to dominate, Edward Winterbourne showed that true strength lay in recognizing and celebrating the strength of others, that gentleness was not weakness, but the highest form of courage. Their legacy lived on, not just in their children, but in the subtle shifts they created in society's expectations. Other women began to take more active roles in estate management, inspired by the Duchess's example. Other men began to see their wives as partners rather than possessions, recognizing that love could multiply rather than divide power. The roses that bloom at Winterbourne Abbey speak their own language of hope. Each impossible hybrid reminds visitors that beauty can emerge from the most unlikely combinations, that strength and delicacy can coexist, that what society deems impossible may simply be something that has not yet been attempted with sufficient patience and love. And what of Lady Ravenswood, your humble chronicler? Let us simply say that I had the privilege of witnessing this remarkable union firsthand. And if I shed more than a few tears at their renewed vows, well, even the most experienced observer of human nature can be moved when witnessing the triumph of true love over every obstacle society and circumstance could devise. For in the end, is that not what we all seek? Not just love, but recognition, not just passion, but partnership, not just marriage, but a meeting of souls that transforms two separate melodies into one perfect harmony. Their story gives us hope that love can be patient without being passive, that it can be gentle without being weak, that it can honor both tradition and transformation. In a world that often seems to offer only extremes, the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne proved that there is a middle way, a path of mutual respect and shared growth that leads not to compromise, but to completion.